Over the years, millions of people have enjoyed the benefits of cardiovascular equipment in health clubs, cardiovascular equipment in their homes, and obviously the use of cardiovascular equipment in the rehabilitation facilities. Started with the treadmill, went to the stationary bicycle, and then there's the advent of the stepper, and more recently the ellipse. These cardiovascular pieces of equipment allow an individual to maintain cardiovascular fitness and maintain a feeling of well-being. What's interesting about these pieces of equipment is they're all designed in what we call the sagittal plane. As we watch someone move about, we actually see that they actually move forward, and because of that, when people designed equipment, they decided that they would utilize that same forward motion or that same forward and back motion to facilitate the motion that would create the exercise or create the activity. For example, treadmills are appropriately designed with a belt that moves in what we call a sagittal plane, or a plane that is in the same direction that the body is moving. A bike, obviously, when you sit on the seat, the pedals go around. The pedals are staying in what we call the sagittal plane. When the stepper was designed, it was designed with the same philosophy. Basically, the stepper, we take a look at it, the pedals actually go down and back, and so they stay again in the sagittal plane to allow the body to exercise in the sagittal plane. More recently, the ellipses took advantage of this as well, and as we take a look at the mechanics of an ellipse, we actually see that the pedals go down, slide on a track, and then come back up because of the mechanism that's designed in the ellipse. However, when we look at the body, we find out that the body has been designed entirely different relative to the direction of motion it will choose to go in. By that, if we choose to go in a direction, we will go and move primarily in the sagittal plane. However, when we do a biomechanical analysis of our body, we find out that the joints and the muscles have been designed to create a force more in what we call the frontal plane in order to allow us to move in the sagittal plane. For example, if you just watch someone walk from the front or watch them walk from the back, you'll see a sway of the center of gravity from side to side. What this center of gravity is doing is loading the muscles in the trunk, loading the muscles in the back, loading the muscles in the hips, and loading the muscles in the legs to allow the muscles to become effective to propel us to go forward. When we do analysis on force platforms, we find that the force that we create really has nothing to do with the direction that we're going. And that basically tells us that the body has chosen to use a different plane of motion to facilitate the force, to create the force, to produce a force, to allow us to move forward. Therefore, when we're on a treadmill, we are reacting to that sagittal plane force. When we're on a bike, we only can react to the sagittal plane force. When we're on a stepper, we can only react to that sagittal plane force, and when we're on the ellipse, we can only react to that sagittal plane force. Therefore, when we go in and we have a choice of cardiovascular equipment to utilize for strength, for conditioning, for aerobic capability, and even for rehabilitation, our choices were limited to the sagittal plane, and they were actually what we would call a limitation of function. There were no appropriate environments to get in to allow us to actually condition and train and strengthen the muscles in our lower legs, the muscles in our thighs, even more importantly, the muscles in our hips, and more importantly than that, the muscles in our trunk, where most of the force is generated from our body. Therefore, we now have available to us a new dimension of rehabilitation, a new dimension of exercise, a new dimension of cardiovascular equipment that we call 3D aerobic exercise. We call it 3D rehabilitation. And the 3D rehabilitation that's being introduced today is the pyramid Stryder. The pyramid Stryder is a new dimension of exercise simply because it mimics what the body wants. A great example to begin to try to explain why utilizing a plane of motion, a production of motion, a force of motion that goes side to side is taking a look at rollerblades. If you take a look at rollerblades, the blades are placed actually in the sagittal plane on the boot. However, if we use the sagittal plane to produce the force, for instance, if we use the same philosophy that the steppers have used, we would find out that yes, we would move, but we wouldn't be able to produce any force. We wouldn't feel any sensation up into our upper legs. We wouldn't feel any sensation into our hips. We wouldn't be able to produce a force to get ourselves to go forward. However, when given rollerblades, we quickly choose to produce a force where we push out to the side of the blade. And as we push out on the side of the blade, we're able to generate a force up into our trunk, up into our abdominals, up into our back, and more importantly, into our hips to allow a generation of force so we can actually move forward very quickly, very efficiently. Therefore, when we experience the new dimension of exercise, when we experience the new three-dimensional cardiovascular equipment, the first thing we sense is that our body is now being treated. Our body is now in an environment where it can take advantage of how it was put together. It takes advantage of the muscles that actually wrap themselves around the bones to produce the force. Every muscle in our lower leg, every muscle into our foot, every muscle in our thigh, every muscle around our hips and even into our groin, all of our abdominal muscles and all of our trunk muscles are designed to be loaded in the frontal plane. Gravity, through a sway effect, allows those muscles to be loaded, and when they're loaded, they can lengthen and then explode. Therefore, when we experience the three-dimensional cardiovascular exercise, the experience is a totally new experience. The experience is an experience that mimics function. It's an experience that we actually can say, I can feel the exercise doing what I want the exercise to do, and that is to make me more functional, and that is to take advantage of the large muscles of my body. Therefore, what we'd like to do today is to share with you a little bit of the difference between sagittal plane exercise and the new dimension of exercise, three-dimension cardiovascular equipment with the use of the pyramid Stryder. We have an opportunity to take advantage of taking a look at Doug and Ben. As you can see, Ben is on a traditional stepper. Again, this traditional stepper has the action and the reaction of the body in what we call the sagittal plane. The pedals are basically oriented only in the sagittal plane. The pedals are going down and back, and Ben's body has to react to that in order to get himself back up to reset the pedal, so to speak. Doug is on the pyramid Stryder. His pedals are oriented in the frontal plane, and they have a special biomechanical design to that orientation to allow him to take advantage of that frontal plane. So the major difference we see here is that in the typical stepper, we're oriented in the sagittal plane. In the pyramid Stryder, we now have a three-dimensional plane of motion where we're facilitating the frontal plane. Perhaps the biggest difference that you'll quickly see is what happens to their trunk and what happens to their body. When Ben reacts in the sagittal plane, the only pressure that he can put against the pedal is a pressure to bring him back in the sagittal plane. Again, we have very few muscles that do that. A lot of times, because we don't have any muscles, the utilizer of these particular types piece of equipment will complain of knee pain. Many times they'll complain of hip pain, and they'll complain of joint pain because the muscles aren't able to effectively protect that. So you'll see more of a sagittal plane reaction. You won't see much body sway. He won't feel much into his hips. He will feel very little into his back, and he will feel absolutely nothing into the abdominal musculature. In this particular plane of motion, we see in order to react that the foot has to push sideways, just like in a rollerblade, just like in walking, just like in sprinting, just like in any activity where we want to produce a force. This actually is even more like hitting a golf ball because we actually push off the side of our foot in order to generate a force through our body. So you can see Doug, his center of gravity is swaying back and forth. You can see because of that his hips are rotating, and you can also see because of that he's using his abdominals, he's using his back muscles, and he's using the major muscles of his thighs and his legs. Therefore, there's very little stress on the knees, very little stress on the ankles, very little stress on the hips, and very, very little stress on the back. Now, we can actually magnify this, obviously, if we ask them to just turn it up a little bit and see how their body has to react going a little quicker. So, Ben, you can turn yours up. Nice job. Doug, if you can turn yours up. Good job. Okay, and again, just react to the pedals. Again, Ben has to react only to the sagittal plane. The pedal's going down in the sagittal plane, so he has to only react there. He has no ability to actually utilize the major muscle groups in his body to react. And therefore, this is a hugely different feel. Doug has to react to the reaction of the frontal plane reaction. His foot, because it's going out to the side, inside his foot he has a joint called the subtalar joint. It's a torque converter. Immediately it takes that side-to-side motion, and that side-to-side motion is translated and transferred into the rotational motion that you can see up into his hips. More importantly, you can see up into his back and up into his abdominals. This is more like walking. This is more like running. This is more like function. Yes, they're both aerobic activities. Yes, they're both activities that you can take advantage of, but biomechanically speaking, taking advantage of the frontal plane, taking advantage of the transverse plane, which then allows Doug to effectively move in the sagittal plane, allows him to attack all the muscle groups, not only aerobically, but anaerobically if he so desires. Over here, Ben's already getting into the typical motion of what we call the sagittal plane stepper. Because it's driving him in the sagittal plane, the typical utilizer of this will start to flex forward and basically try to kick in some other muscles in order to generate the force. So just from this angle, where you can see a lot of the frontal plane motion, there is a tremendous difference between the use of this. Now, just for fun, what I'm going to ask these gentlemen to do is actually switch up so you can see the big fella on the stepper, and we'll take a look at Ben taking advantage of the three-dimensional activity on the pyramid strider. Taking a look at Doug, Doug's whole body orientation has changed because now he has to react only to motion in the sagittal plane. Therefore, he cannot load the subtalar joint that we just talked about. He cannot load his hips and he cannot load his trunk. He has to react to actually responding to the motion of the pedal only in the sagittal plane. Therefore, we won't see the same sway in the frontal plane. We don't see the same advantage in the transverse plane. We don't see the major muscle groups being properly loaded. Over here, Ben now has gone from somebody who has been forced to stay in the sagittal plane and generate forces that his body has difficulty generating, to now taking advantage of generating forces in the frontal plane, generating forces in the transverse plane, and obviously in the sagittal plane. So when we take a look at Ben as he pushes off the pedal, his foot then talks to his knee, talks to his hip, and then loads the hip muscles. It loads the back muscles and it loads the abdominal muscles. And you actually can see that Ben's body is now smart enough to even take advantage of that even more, and allowing his shoulder muscles and his scapular muscles and even his pectoralis muscles to take advantage and get inside the flow. Again, if we just simply were looking at Ben moving, we'd say Ben is actually sprinting down the court, or Ben is actually participating in something functional. We're over here, Doug's going to quickly migrate into the typical stepper posture, where he's going to flex forward because that's the only way he can actually generate the force to keep the pedals going. When we look at somebody from the side, we're actually taking advantage of looking at primarily sagittal plane reaction. In other words, motion in the sagittal plane of flexion and extension. Interestingly enough, on your left-hand side, Ben on the stepper is on a piece of equipment that actually creates the reaction in the sagittal plane, but we can actually see how what we would consider functionally abnormal that reaction is. Yes, his ankle's moving. Yes, his knee's moving in the sagittal plane. His hip's going through flexion and extension. But because he's unable to generate a force in the frontal plane and unable to take advantage of the rotational or transverse plane, we see a very typical posture on the stepper. When we have an opportunity to take a look at Trevor on the right, because he is in a functional plane of motion, he is generating a force that his body is actually designed to do, he actually has more effective sagittal plane motion. In other words, his sagittal plane motion is more functional and more effective than Ben on the left-hand side, even though Ben is being generated in the sagittal plane. So when we take a look at Trevor on the right-hand side, he has effective sagittal plane motion in his ankle and his knee and his hip and even in his trunk, simply because he is generating a force, generating a reaction, generating a chain reaction from the pedal of the pyramid strider up through his foot, up to his knee and his hip in the sagittal plane, because his hip, his knee, his foot, and especially his trunk is allowed to go through the transverse plane. So we see the transverse plane motion on the right-hand side. We see the frontal plane motion, the back-to-back motion, as well as effective sagittal plane motion. Where again, on the left-hand side, we see the dormancy of the sagittal plane, simply because we're not able to load the muscles in the frontal plane and the transverse plane as we can in the right-hand side. That's why the left-hand side is a very traditional, very typical sagittal plane cardio, where on the right-hand side with the pyramid